Hi everyone, and welcome back to the next review video for the living environments or biology regions. This is Unit 5, looking at evolution. So the first thing we have in this unit is the evidence of evolution. And there are a few different ways that scientists have found evidence of evolution, and the first is comparative anatomy. So this is comparing physical structures, or things that have developed inside organisms, and there are two main ones you want to know. So the first are called homologous structures, and these are structures that are similar in form. So what these are structures like, for example, the human hands. Whale fins have the same type of bones. They have the same five, like what we have fingers are inside their fins. And those are homologous structures as they're similar in form but found in different organisms. And these would represent a common ancestor. And the second one you want to know are called vestigial structures. And these are structures that are basically left over. So these used to be advantageous to us at some point in the past, but as the species have evolved, they no longer have a need for vestigial structures. And an example of a vestigial structure in humans are the appendix. The appendix, oftentimes, if people get appendicitis, they can get their appendix removed and live perfectly fine. But it used to help us digest certain foods way back in our past, which is why we still have it left over. So those are the two things you want to know for comparative anatomy. The second one is comparative embryology, which is comparing the embryos of different organisms. So these show similar development to show common ancestry, specifically in embryos. And if you remember what an embryo is from the reproduction unit, it's the stage, I guess, after the zygote is formed. That's before a fetus. So it's comparing the very very early on of a fetus from after the reproduction has occurred, and that can show similar development. And often embryos between different organisms look very very similar. And now the final one we look at is comparative biochemistry, which is looking at specifically molecular evidence. So this includes DNA sequences, looking at various proteins, looking at the amino acid sequences that build up the proteins, things like gel electrophoresis, which we looked at in one of your New York State labs to look at the banding patterns to show the similarities. And there are a bunch of different things we look at. So these are all molecular evidence. And what you want to know is that the more similarities that you find between different molecular sequences of organisms, the more closely related that the two organisms are, and the more common recent ancestor they have. So this looks at specific molecular evidence like DNA, amino acids, etc. Okay, so now we're going to go on to look at evolutionary trees. So evolutionary trees, which we see here on the right, are trees to show the evolution of species. So what we see on these are that species that have a more recent common ancestor are more closely related. So I'll annotate this diagram in a second, but it goes from the very bottom, shows the oldest organisms, and then the furthest up, labeled in this one A through G, show the recent species. So you can use diagrams like this to determine the evolutionary relationships between organisms and to see how close they are. So here we'll just annotate this. You can see if you're looking at F and G, these are two organisms down here. To see when they have a most common ancestor, you can trace the tree back to see when they meet, which would be right here. So this one right here is their most recent ancestor. This is their ancestral species, and this is when the speciation event occurred. You can do the same thing for another organism. Let's say you want to look at where organism D over here and organism B have the nearest common ancestor. You would be tracing back along the tree till where they meet, and you would see that right here is their most common ancestor. So this allows us to tell when they diverge into different species and how closely related they are. So we also know that the closer they are, the more closely they're related. So for example, D and C would be closer related because they share a common ancestor here, while D and B would be more further related or have a later a common ancestor that was way further back in the past because it's all the way back over here, which is significantly farther. So that's how you analyze evolutionary trees. Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is Darwin and the process of natural selection. So Charles Darwin discovered this, as we know, like the Galapagos, his Darwin's finches and the Galapagos Islands was where he came up with this theory of natural selection, which is widely accepted today. So this theory states that organisms that have a favorable trait or a gene for a specific environment or that codes for something specifically advantageous in that scenario will be able to survive better. They will then, because they survive, they can reproduce, and they will pass on that favorable trait, which means that it becomes more common in the pool. However, those that do not have the favorable trait will die off as they're not well adapted to the environment. So this means that when random mutations occur, and with random variation from both sexual reproduction and just random genetic mutations, certain traits are performed, and the environment determines which ones are advantageous. Those that are advantageous will help that organism survive, pass it on, and that will continue going. However, those that don't have the favorable trait will die off. And we give the example of birds. For example, the birds that have webbed feet are more successful often because they can swim faster and catch more fish, which means that these birds are more likely to reproduce because they're better adapted to the environment, and birds without webbed feet will likely die off. So the two ways variation occurs, I just spoiled it because I said it above, but this occurs through sexual reproduction and mutations. So mutations occur, as we looked at earlier in the genetics unit, they occur randomly in the genetic sequence, and they can only be passed on if they occur in gametes, because that can then be passed on to the offspring. And sexual reproduction also causes variation because a unique set of chromosomes from each parent organism is put together to create a unique genome for the offspring. So now we have, why is genetic variation important in a species? So you want to know that genetic variation is really important to have in a species because it allows a species a better chance to survive in a changing environment, because there's more greater variation or biodiversity. This means that if there is some form of change in the environment, like something that's damaging to the organism, that means that if there are organisms that are varied and they have variation within the species, even if some organisms die, other organisms will survive on, pass on their traits, and continue the survival of the species, which also reduces the chances of extinction for a species because it's more likely that at least some individuals in the population will survive. That's why you really want to have genetic variation, and that's why organisms that sexually reproduce and have these random mutations are more likely to survive for longer. The next thing we're going to look at is bacterial and insect resistance. And this is when certain bacteria have a mutation to resist antibiotics. So if you ever hear about ABRs, which stand for antibiotic resistance, it's when these bacteria have a mutation that occurs randomly, so they resist the antibiotics. This is why it's really important whenever you go to a doctor and they give you pills to take for antibiotics and they say you have to finish the course. That's because if you allow certain bacteria to survive, these ones are likely going to pass on their antibiotic resistance, which means that it's a lot harder to kill. These ones can survive to pass on, and this mutation to the offspring allows superbugs and superbacteria that are really hard to kill with antibiotics and can be very damaging. So the second one are insects. It's very similar. Certain insects also have a random mutation that allows them to help resist pesticides. So whenever farmers use pesticides to stop insects from eating all their crops, certain insects can have a mutation that allows them to resist them. And then again, these insects will survive and reproduce to pass on the mutation for pesticide resistance, which means that it's a lot harder to then kill these insects and resist pesticides. Okay, now the final thing you want to know for this evolution is the difference between natural selection and artificial selection, which is also called selective breeding. So natural selection, which is what Darwin was talking about and what Darwin observed in the Galapagos Islands, is when the environment chooses the favorable trait. So this is when, based on certain environmental conditions like the food available, the various abiotic factors, various other biotic factors like the other organisms around, whichever trait is most favorable to suit that environment, that's a form of natural selection. So the environment is choosing. In contrast, artificial selection or selective breeding is when humans choose. So humans will choose the desirable trait, and we see this, for example, with dog breeding. Anyone that has a pet dog that's some designer breed, that was artificially bred by humans, where humans put together two specific dogs because they wanted a certain desirable trait. This is different than natural selection because it's not traits being bred or traits that are reproducing because it helps them survive in the environment, but rather humans are choosing something for whatever reason they want. It could be they're producing specific rice to be larger to feed more people, like various GMO products. It could be with dogs or anything that's chosen by the humans. Okay, so now we're going to look at some review questions. We got 3 here that I squeezed all on this page. So the first says, which diagram below indicates that species D is more closely related to C than it is to either A or B? So in this one, we want to see where the more common recent ancestor. So we see that species D will have a more common ancestor with C, but less with A and B. So number 1 would not be our answer, because all 4 organisms can be traced back to one common ancestor at the same point. So they're all equally related, so 25 would not be our answer. For the next one, for number 2, we have C and D share the most common ancestor here, and A and B share the common ancestor here. And this would be our best answer because it means that species D is closely related to C because it has an extremely close common ancestor, but its most common ancestor with both A and B is all the way back here. So number 2 would be our best answer, but we'll check through the other ones just to be sure. Number 3, we have D has a common ancestor with both B and A right here, and a very later common ancestor with C all the way back there, which would not be our answer because we want it to be more closely related to C, and in this case it's more closely related to both A and B. And then the final one is number 4, where we see that species D is most closely related to species B, and that's not our answer because we want it to be related to C. So this one just switched around B and C. So our best answer here would be number 2. Okay, now we'll move on to number 8. We have the endangered Everglades snail kite is a predatory bird which usually feeds on small snails. Conservationists feared that the snail kite would face a greater decline when the Everglade was invaded by a species of larger snails that the birds had historically struggled to eat. But the snail kite populations increased over several years, and the snail kites now have larger beaks and larger bodies. So that last part there is key. It shows that over generations they have changed, which demonstrates that evolution has occurred, and they have now changed something to adapt to the environment. So we can see the question says, this change in the snail kite can be best explained by, number 1 is selective breeding with larger kites. This would not be the answer because it doesn't say anything about scientists or conservationists specifically taking certain birds and breeding them together. So it's not selective breeding, but rather it's something natural. So that takes us to option number 2, which says natural selection after environmental change. This one would be our best answer because it's a natural event that occurs after the environment is changed. So the environmental change is that there is an invasion of larger snail species that occurred, and the natural selection occurred where the larger birds that were able to eat these snails survived, passed on their traits, and caused the snail kites to now have larger beaks and bodies. But again, just to be safe, we'll look through the last 2. Number 3 says genetic engineering to modify specific genes. This did not occur because nowhere in the passage does it say that humans went into the genome and changed anything, so it would not be number 3. And number 4 is ecological succession. So it's not ecological succession because it wasn't that all the organisms were cleared and plants started growing in the system. Rather, it was just a change in one specific organism. So number 4 would not be our answer either. Okay, now we have one last question. Number 23. A certain species of rough-skinned newt produces an extremely powerful toxin that helps prevent attacks by predators. However, one predator, the garter snake, can eat these newts without being affected by the toxin. Which statement best explains the resistance of garter snakes to the new toxin? So, number 1 says the snakes needed to become resistant to the toxins in order to survive, so they developed a toxin-resistant gene. This would not be our answer because evolution doesn't work. This is one of the key things that Darwin discovered or noted in theory. Evolution occurs over a long period of time. One organism doesn't just say, I want to be able to eat these, so I'm going to develop this. It occurs through over a longer period of time with random mutations and different species and different combinations through sexual reproduction. So it's not one snake needed to become resistant, so they developed a toxin-resistant gene. It's rather that gene was mutated and it happened to be advantageous. So number 1 would not be our answer. The second one is, as the newts became more toxic, the snakes became increasingly resistant in order to survive. So this one would also not be our answer because it's not like a constant stream where you say the newts became more toxic, so now the snakes became increasingly more toxic to survive as well. That's the same issue really with number 1. Number 3 says exposure to a newt toxin caused a mutation in the snakes, which increased resistance to the toxin in the snakes. So this one, while it does have the mutation part, this one is also not our answer because it's not that exposure to the toxin caused the mutation. The mutation occurred randomly, which allowed them to have resistance to that toxin. So it's not that they ate the toxin and then suddenly, like Spider-Man or something, they changed and developed this new gene to help them eat it. Rather, it happened randomly, which then allowed them to eat. So number 3 would not be our answer. And this leaves us with number 4, that a random genetic mutation that resulted in toxin resistance increased the survival rates of the snakes that had it, and they pass it on to their offspring. So number 4 would be our best answer, because this describes natural selection as in Darwin's theory. It says because there was a random mutation that allowed one snake to be able to eat these organisms, it survived better than the other snakes, it passed on that trait, and now the majority of snakes have that ability to eat these poisonous newts. So number 4 would be our best answer there. And that's everything. Thank you for listening.